Something inside Formula One is starting to break. Not the engines, not the cars, not even the teams, the entire direction of the sport. Because for the first time in years, Formula One drivers are no longer quietly complaining behind closed doors. Now they are openly pushing back against the FIA and the 2026 regulations. And when Max Verstappen starts sounding frustrated about the future of Formula One, people listen. Because this is not just another rules debate, this is bigger than that. The FIA believes the 2026 era will modernize Formula One. More sustainable engines, more electrical power, more efficiency, a cleaner image for the future. But inside the paddock, a completely different narrative is starting to grow. Drivers are worried, teams are nervous, fans are angry, and some people inside Formula One are quietly asking a question nobody wanted to ask a year ago. What if the FIA is creating a version of Formula One that nobody actually wants? That fear exploded after multiple drivers began criticizing the direction of the new regulations. Not just privately, publicly. And the most important voice of all was Max Verstappen. Because Verstappen has already hinted several times that he is losing interest in the political side of Formula One, he has talked about shorter careers, different racing series, endurance racing, even life outside Formula One. That alone would already scare Formula One. But now combine that with growing frustration over the 2026 cars. Suddenly, this stops looking like normal driver complaints and starts looking like a serious identity crisis for the sport itself. The FIA says these new rules are necessary to protect Formula One long term. But critics inside the paddock think the opposite could happen. They fear racing could become more artificial, more battery dependent, more complicated for casual fans, and maybe less exciting for the drivers themselves. Some fans are already comparing the future cars to Formula E, and inside Formula One, that comparison is almost toxic, because Formula One built its global identity on danger, aggression, sound, and raw emotion, not efficiency management. Now, to be fair, the FIA is under massive pressure too. Manufacturers want sustainability, sponsors want a cleaner image, governments want environmental alignment, and Formula One itself wants to keep growing in the United States. So, from the FIA perspective, the 2026 rules probably feel unavoidable. But the problem is this: the people actually driving the cars are starting to sound unconvinced. And once fans hear drivers losing confidence, panic spreads fast, especially when the face of the sport is Max Verstappen. Because Verstappen is not just dominating Formula One right now, he is defining it, which means if he sounds disconnected from the future of the sport, fans immediately start wondering something dangerous. Does Formula One have a bigger problem than it wants to admit? And the deeper people look into the 2026 regulations, the more uncomfortable this conversation becomes. Because the fears inside the paddock are not only about performance, they are about what Formula One is becoming. If you are still excited for the 2026 era, or if you think the FIA is completely ruining Formula One, let me know in the comments. Because right now, fans are completely split on where this sport is heading next. And honestly, that divide might be getting worse every single week. At first, this looked like another classic Formula One argument. Teams complaining, drivers frustrated, the FIA defending new regulations. Formula One has survived those battles for decades. But then something changed. The criticism stopped sounding temporary and started sounding personal, because more and more drivers began reacting the same way. Not excitement, not curiosity, concern. And once that concern spread across the paddock, the entire conversation around 2026 became darker. Christian Horner started openly questioning whether the new regulations would actually improve racing. Helmut Marko warned the sport could be moving in the wrong direction. Even engineers inside multiple teams reportedly became nervous about how extreme the electrical dependency could become. That is where the fear really starts, because Formula One fans can accept slower cars. They can accept regulation changes. They can even accept dominant teams. What they do not accept is the feeling that Formula One is losing its identity. And suddenly that fear is everywhere. Fans on Reddit are calling the future cars artificial. Twitter exploded with debates comparing Formula One to Formula E. YouTube comments turned into full-scale arguments about whether the FIA understands what fans actually love about the sport. And honestly, the FIA created part of this problem themselves, because the messaging around the 2026 era sounds clean and corporate: efficiency, sustainability, energy recovery, electrical optimization. But Formula One fans do not emotionally connect to those words. They connect to chaos, danger, noise, aggression, drivers fighting on the limit. That disconnect is becoming impossible to ignore, especially because the current generation of Formula One is exploding in popularity right now. The United States audience is growing. Drive to Survive created millions of new fans. Race attendance is booming. So many fans are asking the same thing. Why risk changing the formula this aggressively now? And maybe the most dangerous part for the FIA is this: the drivers themselves are becoming the voice of fan frustration. That changes everything. Because once fans believe the drivers are on their side against the FIA, the entire power dynamic shifts. And Max Verstappen sits right in the center of that storm, not just because he is the best driver in Formula One right now, but because he increasingly sounds like somebody emotionally disconnected from where the sport is heading. That is why every single Verstappen interview suddenly gets analyzed differently now. Every frustrated answer, every sarcastic comment, every hint about endurance racing, fans are no longer hearing normal complaints. They are hearing somebody slowly falling out of love with Formula One. And if the biggest star in the sport starts emotionally checking out, Formula One has a massive problem. Because this situation may already be bigger than regulations. It may be turning into a fight over the soul of Formula One itself. And here is where things become even more uncomfortable for the FIA. Some people inside the paddock believe the 2026 crisis is exposing a hidden problem Formula One has been avoiding for years. Maybe modern Formula One is becoming too complicated for its own good. Not just technically, emotionally, because fans do not fall in love with racing through spreadsheets. They fall in love through emotion, the sound of the engines, the danger, the rivalries, the feeling that drivers are barely controlling the cars. And many fans are terrified that Formula One is slowly engineering those emotions out of the sport. Now, some people completely disagree with that idea. They believe Formula One has no choice but to evolve, that sustainability matters more than nostalgia, that the sport cannot survive by living in the past forever. And honestly, that debate is becoming one of the biggest civil wars Formula One has seen in years. So I want to ask you something. If Formula One becomes cleaner and more advanced, but loses part of what made people fall in love with it in the first place, is that actually progress? Because the deeper this 2026 conversation goes, the harder that question becomes to answer. And the scariest part is Formula One may not fully understand the consequences yet. And maybe the clearest proof that this crisis is real is the fact that nobody inside Formula One seems fully comfortable anymore. Not the drivers, not the teams, not even the FIA. Because if the future was truly exciting, Formula One would not need to constantly defend it. Think about that. The best eras of Formula One sold themselves naturally. Fans heard the engines and instantly fell in love. Drivers wanted to push harder, teams wanted more speed, everything felt emotional, raw, dangerous. But the 2026 era already feels different before it has even started. And that uncertainty is spreading everywhere. You can hear it in the interviews, you can see it in fan reactions, you can even feel it in the way Formula One talks about itself now. The sport sounds defensive, and maybe that is why this entire situation suddenly feels so dangerous. Because Formula One is no longer only fighting criticism from outside the sport, it is fighting doubt from within. That is why Max Verstappen matters so much in this story. Because whether people love him or hate him, Verstappen represents pure modern Formula One dominance. He is the benchmark, the superstar, the driver who should theoretically be the perfect face of the next era. But instead, he increasingly sounds disconnected from it. And once fans notice that emotional disconnect, they start asking impossible questions. What happens if Verstappen eventually walks away earlier than expected? What happens if more drivers start openly rejecting the direction of the sport? What happens if Formula One creates cars that are technologically impressive but emotionally empty? That is the nightmare scenario nobody inside Formula One wants to admit publicly, because Formula One does not survive on engineering alone. It survives on obsession. Fans obsess over rivalries, over noise, over danger, over emotion, over moments that feel unforgettable. And right now, many fans are scared those moments are becoming secondary to corporate priorities and political messaging. Now, to be fair, Formula One absolutely needed to modernize in some ways. The world is changing, manufacturers are changing, technology is changing, but there is a difference between evolution and losing your identity. And maybe that is the real reason the 2026 debate became so explosive so quickly. People are not only debating regulations, they're debating what Formula One should emotionally feel like. That is a much bigger fight. And honestly, Formula One may be entering the most dangerous balancing act in its modern history. Because if the FIA ignores sustainability pressures, manufacturers could leave. But if the FIA pushes too far away from what fans and drivers emotionally connect with, the sport risks something even worse, losing its soul. And maybe that explains why the reaction from fans has become so intense recently. Deep down, people are afraid this is the beginning of a version of Formula One that feels colder, cleaner, more artificial, a version where efficiency matters more than emotion. And if that future arrives, the scariest part is this. Formula One might realize the damage too late. Because once fans emotionally disconnect from a sport, getting them back becomes incredibly difficult, especially when the biggest stars themselves seem uncertain about the future. That is why this entire 2026 situation feels bigger than a normal FIA controversy. This feels like Formula One trying to decide what it wants to become. And the outcome of that fight could shape the next decade of the sport. So now the question becomes very simple. Can Formula One evolve without destroying the emotional chaos that made people fall in love with it in the first place? Or are we watching the beginning of a future that drivers, teams, and fans may eventually regret? Because right now, nobody inside Formula One seems completely sure of the answer. And honestly, that uncertainty may be the biggest warning sign of all. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want more deep Formula One stories about the politics, rivalries, and future of the sport, subscribe and stick around. Because the closer Formula One gets to 2026, the more chaotic this story is going to become.